Is Andy Kim. I'm a medical anthropologist based at the Developmental Pathways for Health Research Unit at WITS, and I'm also a postdoctoral research fellow at the Massachusetts General Hospital in the United States. Thank you very much for attending my talk, and thank you to the organizers for allowing me to present my research to you today. And today I'll be presenting to you some data that from a study that we've been conducting on the mental health impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic among psychiatric healthcare workers in Johannesburg. And the title of my presentation is Psy-COVID: Perceptions, Experiences, and Impacts of COVID-19 among Tertiary and Specialized Psychiatric Hospitals in Johannesburg. So as many of us know, the COVID-19 pandemic first started in South Africa in the beginning of March 2020, which is when the first confirmed case of COVID-19 was detected. And a few weeks later, President Cyril Ramaphosa commenced